Bring in show music, please.
Hi, I'm CNBC producer Katie Kramer. Today on Squawk Pod. The Panama Plan. Are we taking back the canal? The $5 billion a year artery of international trade is a target for President Trump, and now a Senate committee is looking into it. Ted Cruz joins us.
The nation of Panama did not build the Panama Canal. America did. The nation of Panama did not pay for the Panama Canal. America did.
And attention must be paid. MSNBC's Chris Hayes on what's really the world's most important commodity.
When you look at companies like Google and Meta, right, what are they actually monetizing? They're actually monetizing our attention.
Plus, the day in DeepSeek, the Chinese AI that is so good it spooked an entire industry and the people who invest in it.
This may be a Sputnik moment. It may be stolen. All of those things may be true and still have a huge impact on the industry.
A short seller takes on the SEC and the rest of today's news that got us squawking.
All right, things that make you go,
It's Tuesday, January 28th.
News you can use.
Squawk Pod begins right now.
Stand Becky by in 3, 2, 1. Cue, please.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Squawk Box right here on CNBC. We're live from the NASDAQ market site in Times Square. I'm Becky Quick, along with Andrew Ross Sorkin. Joe is out sick today.
Meantime, President Trump weighing in on DeepSeek last night at a meeting of the House Republicans in Miami. Here's what he had to say.
The release of DeepSeek AI from a Chinese company should be a wake-up call for our industries that we need to be laser-focused on competing to win, because we have the greatest scientists in the world.
Trump saying that he considered the low-cost model to be, quote, very much a positive development for AI overall, because instead of spending billions, you will spend to reach the same solution. You'll spend less to reach the same solution. And Trump saying he still expects U.S. tech companies to dominate AI. Separately, DeepSeek saying it was hit with a large-scale cyber attack yesterday and was temporarily limiting user registrations. I should also just point out two tweets that I thought were interesting. One was Sam Altman overnight, writing, DeepSeek's R1 is an impressive model, particularly around what they're able to deliver for the price. Right. But we will obviously deliver much better models, he writes. And also, it's legit invigorating to have a new competitor. We will pull up some releases, which I also imagine means we're going to be seeing releases sooner. Yeah. Now, there's a secondary issue, because I want to read you a tweet from Joshua Kushner. Joshua Kushner, of course, runs Thrive Capital, one of the largest venture capital firms, and most importantly, the biggest investor in OpenAI, who you would think has the most at stake here when it comes to all of this. And he says, these pro-America technologists openly supporting a Chinese model that was trained off of leading U.S. frontier models. By the way, I'll interpret that, which is to say there's a view that a lot of this was built on the back, potentially, of Llama
and stolen from,
potentially OpenAI and other things, with chips that likely violate export controls and, according to their own terms of service, take U.S. customer data back to China. And he has one of these emojis that look like I'm looking up in the air. Anyway, I just think it's worth thinking about this morning as we're sort of contemplating everything that's happening here. It's not to say this may be a Sputnik moment. It may be stolen. All of those things may be true and still have a huge impact on the industry.
Yes. Look, it's a game changer. You're right. This is going to be a moment they look back at. I think it's no small issue about what you have to hand over to get DeepSeek downloaded. They were talking about it yesterday on Squawk on the Street, that it has access to all of your Gmail once you do this.
I did not have that experience, but maybe that is true. I'm not aware of.
Steve Kovac, that's what David Faber was talking about yesterday. Steve Kovac was saying that when he signed up, he used his Apple ID because it scrambles your email and some other things that come through. But I think there are some legitimate questions. If you have questions about TikTok, this has to be a whole other exponential layer on what happens, what gets back with it. There is censorship that takes place on this, so it doesn't know or it won't answer questions, a lot of queries on things that the Chinese government does not want you asking questions on. But again, it is spurring things. It's making people stop and reassess, and there's going to be a huge spurring of innovation as a result, I think.
And I may be wrong, so we can talk about this later. You can sign up with your Apple ID or you can sign up with your Google ID. That's possible. Apple does scramble it. I don't know if Google scrambles it.
I don't know.
But I don't know if you have to provide your entire email account. to
That
them.
was just what they were talking about on
Very
Squawk on the Street.
unlikely to me. But
that it would have access to your emails is what they said. Gmail in particular is what they said with it.
Then I have to do more work on that.
Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Young, aye.
The yeas are 68, the nays are 29. The confirmation is confirmed.
The Senate voted yesterday to confirm Scott Bessent as Treasury Secretary. That vote was 68 to 29, with 16 Democrats joining all Republicans to confirm Bessent for the post. Last night on Air Force One, President Trump was asked about an FT report that said Bessent prefers a gradual approach to tariffs, starting with a 2.5% universal baseline tariff that would increase over time. I think what the FT was quoting was saying it would go up every month. The president, though, said that he thought that report was mistaken and that a 2.5% tariff would not be acceptable. He'd like to see much higher tariffs. Among Trump's other comments, he was asked by reporters last night if Microsoft is in discussions to buy the U.S. arm of TikTok, and he said yes. He also said that there's a lot of interest in TikTok, but he didn't elaborate further. AI startup Perplexity has submitted a bid for TikTok. Billionaire Frank McCourt made a formal offer earlier this month. Microsoft and Oracle were in the running to acquire TikTok back in 2020 when Trump first pressured ByteDance to sell the property. CNBC is reaching out to Microsoft for comment on the president's remarks that came outside of normal business hours, and I don't believe we have a response to it yet. But it is interesting to see the potential for what was happened. I think President Trump also said that if there wasn't a deal that was put together, that TikTok would go dark.
I am still so fascinated by your comments about the Gmail.
I don't know. This is what they were saying on Squawk on the Street.
Apparently, according to at least a couple of things I'm reading, there's some very strange words in their terms of service about what they're able to pick off your Gmail if you sign up using your Google authentication account, maybe. So I'm.
Did you do that when you downloaded it?
I'm now thinking about it. I'm being. This is live TV. I'm thinking through.
You're like, wait a second. How did I sign up for this thing?
Yeah, I'm concerned. Anyway, more to come on that.
Yeah.
Apple releasing news you can use, but I want to get to the bottom of that one. Apple releasing some software updates for iPhones and iPads and Macs yesterday that turn on Apple Intelligence by default for users with supported devices. The updates also disable AI summaries for news apps, which have gained a reputation for twisting news notifications to display inaccurate facts. I've been having a lot of that. Also, just text messages coming in with the Apple Intelligence telling me that the text message is something just that it isn't. Apple initially rolling out, I shouldn't say not that it isn't, it's just not helpful. I'd like to just see the actual message.
Yeah.
Rolling out its AI features by requiring users to opt in at this point, which slowed the pace of adoption. Apple allowed Apple to test new features and ensure it had enough server capacity. Users who wish to turn off these AI features can still do so. You can do it in the Settings app.
Google said yesterday that it will change the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America in Google Maps after the Trump administration updates its official government sources. It will also start using the name Mount McKinley for the mountain in Alaska that's currently called Denali. In a post on X, Google said that it has a long-standing practice of applying name changes when they have been updated in official government sources. Google said the name Gulf of Mexico would remain displayed for users in Mexico. Users in other countries will see both names. All right, things that make you go,
Pretty much where I'm at right now. I'm still working on the Gmail and on Josh Kushner's.
Josh Kushner's itself, right? Yeah.
That's the emoji of the morning. Meantime, activist short seller Andrew left. This is fascinating, and we should have a debate about this. He wants answers from the SEC. We interviewed him here, of course, on the air a couple of weeks ago now. A law firm has now filed a formal petition with the agency on his behalf, calling for rules to clarify what and when investors who publicly comment on securities can trade, for example. So if an investor goes on TV, for example, or has a Substack account, or goes onto Twitter last Friday, ends up talking about liking NVIDIA, I'm making this up as an example, could he then go sell NVIDIA yesterday?
When the story changed.
Or is he not allowed to?
Right.
Last summer, authorities accused Left of manipulating the market and defrauding investors by making misleading statements about his positions in well-known stocks. The SEC and the Department of Justice focusing on how Left publicly described his positions, oftentimes with goal targets and the like. and then how he actually traded. So in some instances, he would say, I'm long this. I think that the target of the company should be this. I'm holding it. And then, the company, then he, right before the earnings call, he would sell it before it ever reached his target.
Well, that's interesting.
And so
too.
the question is, when you disclose or when you declare something, is your target, we have analysts who come on all the time, they say their target is XYZ.
Do you have to then issue some public statement, some posting on X, some social media issuance? Do you have to go back to the original location of where you said it? Because it would make things pretty complicated for an operation like ours.
Well, I think like ours, but I think you have so many investors now who are on podcasts. I mean, look, Warren Buffett publicly goes at annual meetings and talks about how he thinks Apple is great or this is that. And then, of course, sometimes you'll have very famed investors say, I like something, and then you'll read the 13D 3 months later, and you'll find out that
3 months later and 3 days later is a pretty big difference.
Well, but
because one looks like you have created the furor either in favor of or against the selling pressure coming down.
But the 3 months later is you don't know when they sold during that.
But the interesting point is the SEC can then find out. If you go back to everybody who looks differently, the SEC can 100%. Then go back. And if you sold 24 hours after coming in and saying, this is the greatest stock ever, the stock goes up 17% and you sell it, should you be held accountable if...
Well, this is the question.
If you don't tell anybody and it didn't, and by the way, it's up 17%, but you said it was going to be up 150%, and you changed your mind going into it. Obviously, the SEC is trying to create examples and trying to create fear, and that's what the last SEC did.
Right.
Under the last chairman, they were trying to create enough of a concern factor, like they did with Bitcoin, that people just wouldn't do it. They made a lot of public examples where they were just trying to change behavior by the fear factor.
I hate the idea of a pump and dump, what they call a rug pull now in the business.
Yeah.
I'm actually more concerned about what I've described as the sort of the new age pool, where you have multiple people operating together to try to pump up a stock, knowing that they're going to pull it.
You're talking about meme stocks.
Meme stocks, but other stocks as well. I mean, this is now going on, on Reddit and on Telegram and on DMs and Twitter. People are doing this. That's one thing. I have a freedom of speech issue, which is if you want to say that you believe something is great, you should be allowed to do it. And you
have the absolute freedom of speech, but that does not correlate to freedom of speech with doing one thing, saying one thing and doing another when it comes to securities. So the SEC does have the authority to come in and do that.
There's a question about manipulation, and there's a question, though, about how much power you have. And this is what's so interesting to me, which is if Joe Blow on the street were to come on our show and say that he loves NVIDIA, he might not have the power to move a stock. Okay?
With great power comes with great responsibility.
And then, however, Roaring Kitty has power. Warren Buffett has power. Bill Ackman might have power. Somebody else, an analyst, by the way, a new analyst at a bank that you either never heard of or heard of, might have no power.
But an axe on the beat.
But it's very interesting to then sort of decipher who's got power, who doesn't have power. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it's a very sort of talk about slippery slope. And
I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the answer is, but I don't think you can say flat out it's a free speech issue. You can say whatever you want, but when you act and potentially manipulate securities around it, that's a different situation.
The question,
and I'm not accusing Andrew Left of this. I'm sympathetic to his argument that he laid out on the program.
To me, the manipulation issue is if there are records or other things that suggest that somebody says, I'm going to come on either TV or I'm going to put out a tweet or I'm going to go on my Substack account or go on a podcast and I'm going to say, this stock's going to $100. By the way, I've already put in an order to sell it at 30.
Right.
Or that there's some evidence that this is like a genuine effort to pump the stock to then sell it immediately. That to me is manipulation. If you put out a target and then you happen to say, okay, it's actually gone up a lot, I'm getting out of this right now.
Look, I can understand Andrew Left wanting the rules of the road to be put out there so that people can look at this clearly, but I think it was an intentional situation from the last SEC enforcement agency.
The SEC forever, it's not even this last, the SEC forever has been gray on this.
No, but I think Gary Gensler intentionally did a lot of gray activity and going after high-profile things with Bitcoin in particular to try and scare people into not doing things. And I think the SEC would like to be a little gray on the matter so that people walk a little more carefully. It's a cop on the beat type of situation, and it's going to change from agency head to agency head.
Cheese will be next.
Still to come, Senator Ted Cruz on the growing desire to take back the Panama Canal, cabinet confirmation hearings, a remade Justice Department. Oh, it's all part of the first week of Trump 2.0.
At the end of the day, I'm looking at this first week of the administration and I'm excited. I have never seen an administration with so much change, so much energy, and such a mandate from the voters.
Squawk Pod will be right back. Welcome back to Squawk Pod. Here's Andrew Ross Sorkin.
Senate Commerce Committee setting to hold a hearing today on the impact of the Panama Canal on U.S. trade and national security. President Trump has now accused China of operating the canal and vowing during his inaugural address to take it back. Panama strongly criticizing those ideas. Joining us right now is the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, Texas Senator Ted Cruz. Senator, it's great to have you on the broadcast as always. What do you think the true prospect is of, quote unquote, taking back the Panama Canal? What would it cost? How would you do it? And all of the questions that surround it.
Well, Andrew, tomorrow morning, the Senate Commerce Committee is going to have a hearing on the Panama Canal and the impacts on the United States. I'll tell you, when President Trump first raised this, a lot of people, particularly in the media, scoffed. But I think he raised two very serious issues, which is, number one, as you noted, that China has a very significant position in Panama. China has leased and has locations on both ends of the Panama Canal that gives it observation and potentially control of the Panama Canal. Not only that, but China is building a bridge that goes over the Panama Canal that gives them the ability to shut down transit on the Panama Canal. That is a serious both economic threat and national security threat. And number two, the nation of Panama is charging very significant fees, predominantly to the United States, both to commercial shippers and to the U.S. Navy when it transits that canal. And it's worth remembering, the United States built that canal at the cost of over 30,000 lives, at the cost of, in today's dollars, $15 trillion. And when Jimmy Carter gave that canal away, I got to tell you, I was a little kid, but I remember it was I think, shocking at the time. But when he gave that canal away to Panama, he did so pursuant to a treaty that obligated Panama to treat the United States fairly. And so the hearing we're going to have tomorrow is going to be examining how much Panama is complying with the treaty or how much they are in violation of the treaty. And violating a treaty has real consequences.
So, Senator, here's one of the big questions I think that we all have. Let's say we can agree or even stipulate. I don't know whether we agree, we don't. But let's just say that President Carter made a huge strategic error on behalf of the United States by giving away the Panama Canal. Let's just say that for the sake of the conversation. Even if that's the case, then the question to me becomes, and let's say you want it back somehow.
Yeah.
The question is, should it be just, quote unquote, bought back on a commercial basis? And in fact, if they don't want to sell it, that's just the way it is. Or do you believe that we, the United States, should be in a position to either use coercion economically or militarily or anything else to get at that? And if that's the case, then what does that mean for just about everything else that we are doing on the global stage and, frankly, what other countries are doing?
So listen, that's a fair question, and let me be clear at the outset. I'm not in favor of using military force to go invade other countries. I don't think that's the job of our military. But let me point out, Panama is a very different issue from Greenland. Greenland, the president has raised as well, and I think Greenland is a very serious proposal. I think Greenland would have very significant both national security and economic advantages. Greenland is up on the Arctic. Any military battle with either Russia or China, ICBMs or potentially military forces would go over the Arctic. Greenland has an incredibly important strategic position. Greenland also has vast critical minerals and resources. And so there are strong economic reasons as well. Look, if we were to acquire Greenland, it would take likely a purchase from the nation of Denmark. It would take negotiations. That would be acquiring new territory. So your question of how much we should buy it for, that's a perfectly fair conversation that I'll tell you I had in the past 2 weeks with the ambassador of Denmark. Panama's a different situation. The nation of Panama did not build the Panama Canal. America did. The nation of Panama did not pay for the Panama Canal. America did. The nation of Panama did not give thousands and thousands of lives in building the canal. America did. And with Panama, the question is, are they complying with the treaty? Because when Jimmy Carter decided the American lives that were lost building the canal didn't matter, the trillions of dollars we spent didn't matter, he wanted to give it away anyway, at least we got a treaty in exchange for it. And so I think it is a perfectly fair and reasonable conversation to say, is Panama complying with the treaty? You know, it was striking. Panama severed ties with Taiwan in order to get closer to the People's Republic of China. And America, it is not in our interest to have China have a stranglehold on the Panama Canal. I mentioned the bridge that China is building across the canal. That gives them the ability, if we were in an economic or, God forbid, a military battle with China, that would give China the ability to shut down transit across the Panama Canal, which would have a massive negative consequence on the United States. And so I'm grateful for President Trump for raising these questions. And as I said, tomorrow, the Senate Commerce Committee, we're going to have a hearing asking and trying to get answers to every one of these questions.
Hey, Senator, two issues, I guess. Very specifically, what did the treaty say? Just being treated fairly? Or can you tell us exactly what the language is? Because it sounds like that is going to come down to what this all means. And then separately, what did the ambassador to Denmark say to you? Do they sound open to some sort of a deal?
Well, look, both questions. The treaty is called the Neutrality Treaty, and it required them to be neutral to treat the United States fairly. And actually, tomorrow we're going to have one of the witnesses at the hearing I've invited is an international law specialist to testify about what are the consequences of the treaty, what are the remedies to violations. And listen, this is early in the process of investigating and examining these questions. But I think America ought to be defending our own interests. And when it comes to the Panama Canal, you've got 75% of the transit across the Panama Canal is American transit, either U.S. military transit or U.S. commercial transit. And Panama is making roughly $3 billion a year as a consequence of the canal that we paid for and we built them. And so we ought to be vigorously enforcing the treaty. On the second point.
But before you get to the second point, let me just follow up with the first so we don't bounce back and forth. You just said that you don't agree that we should use our military to go take something back by force. But if we say you're not honoring the treaty, you're not treating us fairly, they say shove it, where does that leave us? Would you then use military force to take back something if you think they're violating a treaty?
Well, listen, I think there are all sorts of steps that you take long before military force. Now, it's worth noting, it's not like Panama has a terribly mighty military. If you remember when Manuel Noriega was there, we basically toppled him by playing loud music on boomboxes, and that was enough to topple him and arrest him for being a drug trafficker. And so, as a military matter, it's not complicated, but I don't think the principal tool of U.S. foreign policy should be using the military to engage. Rather, the principal tool ought to be enforcing our legal rights, using economic rights. And by the way, I think President Trump in the last 48 hours demonstrated an extraordinary measure of this with respect to Colombia. So you look at the elections in November, we had a clear mandate from the voters to secure the border. And so we've seen in the first week thousands of illegal immigrants being apprehended, being deported. There were 2 plane loads of illegal immigrants going back to the nation of Colombia, and Colombia's president, Petro, who's a hardcore socialist leftist, anti-American, decided he was not going to allow those planes to land. And it was really quite striking. President Trump announced, okay, then we will impose 25% tariffs on Colombia immediately, and within a week it will ratchet up to 50%. And I've never seen anything like it. Within 8 hours, Colombia caved and said, we will happily accept the illegal immigrants back. And in fact, the president said, I'll send my presidential plane to pick them up. That's an example. We have all sorts of tools of leverage that are way short of military force.
Senator, let me ask you 2 other questions. As a man of the law and someone who I know talks about the principles of the law, I'm curious, 2 things that the president's done that I would imagine actually would outrage you, though I don't know if you would actually say it publicly, but I'm curious. One is firing the inspector generals, not firing the I'm not saying that that's the problem necessarily, but doing it without providing Congress with the 30 days that are enshrined in the law and describing in detail why. Is that something at all that upsets you, given that I do know you care about laws that you create?
Well, listen, under the Constitution, Article 2 of the Constitution gives the president the executive authority, and the executive authority is over every every officer, every employee of the executive authority. And so the president has the authority under the Constitution to terminate
I'm
people
not saying
in,
he doesn't.
in the
I'm saying
executive
that
branch.
the law says, as you know, and was actually re-enshrined effectively a couple years ago, so that there was a 30-day requirement in terms of describing what was happening and the time period. Factually hasn't happened.
What I'm saying is the president has the
that?
authority to terminate people in the executive branch, and I also think inspectors general are incredibly important for ensuring that agencies are following the law. I'm confident the president is going to nominate serious, qualified people to be inspector general that will do exactly that.
But what about that part of the law? You think that's not a real law then?
I think at the end of the day, I'm looking at this first week of the administration, and I'm excited. I have never seen an administration
I'm not
with
disagreeing
so
with
much
any of those
change,
things.
so much energy, and such a mandate from the voters.
I'm just asking you about the law itself, because there's like an actual law and then what's happening, which is different.
Well,
and I think you
look,
we both
Andrew,
got
under our
those.
Constitution, Congress and the president are designed to struggle back and forth, and so we can pass laws putting constraints on the executive, but it is not new for the executive to press back on Congress, and that back and forth was designed by the framers. That's part of the checks and balances. What's clear under Article 2 is the president, all executive power is vested in the president, and that's what he's exercising.
Senator, there's so much more to talk about. We got to run, but I do hope we can continue the conversation. I always enjoy it, and I think we all learn a lot. Thank you, Senator.
I look forward to it.
You bet.
Next on Squawk Pod, what drives the growing divide in American politics? And most importantly, how do we fix it? MSNBC's Chris Hayes on the relentless battle for our attention.
Information is basically infinite and replicable. There's tons of data out there. The thing that's finite is our attention. It can only be in one place or another.
You're listening to Squawk Pod, today with Becky Quick and Andrew Ross Sorkin.
Up and Becky, Q.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Squawk Box. We are live from the NASDAQ market site in Times Square.
We often talk about political division in our country, and our next guest has a theory behind what may be fueling that situation. Chris Hayes is the host of MSNBC's All In with Chris Hayes. He is the author of a fascinating new book. It is titled The Sirens Call, in which he argues that technology companies have triggered a national crisis by developing products that significantly reduce our attention spans and, as a result, may be dividing us. Good morning to you.
It's good to see you.
So help us understand this, because we talk a lot about social media on this broadcast. We talk about X on one side and Instagram on others. So there's sort of two theories of the case, I think, running through this book. One is just about the role of of the media, but also the role of how it's dividing us.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to think about it is that attention, in an information-rich environment, right, which is the information economy, Herb Simon has this insight back in the 1970s that attention is the scarce resource, right? Information consumes attention. Information is basically infinite and replicable. There's tons of data out there. The thing that's finite is our attention. It can only be in one place or another. And so attention becomes actually the really important currency of the age. And in fact, when you look at companies like Google and Meta, right, what are they actually monetizing? They're actually monetizing our attention, much more than they're monetizing information. When you get competitive attention markets, right, what you are driving towards is the most outrageous, the most negative, the thing that is triggering the part of our brainstem that is most conditioned for threat, right, and the lurid. And so we're all sort of in this universe of these incredibly intense attention markets that are always going to kind of drive to that lowest.
So that's the question. Is there a business model that you could even imagine that would allow us to use these type of services and yet not play the attention, either be in the attention business, but without having to take everything to the extent that it goes, whether you're on the far right or far left?
One of the things I think is worth considering about the evolution of digital life is that the first iteration of the internet was an entirely commercial universe with AOL, Prodigy, CompuServe, right? And AOL was the belle of the ball, and of course it was like the largest company, and they bought Time Warner. And that was actually replaced by a non-commercial open version of the internet. The thing that gave us Wikipedia, Mark Andreessen's developing of the Mosaic web browser, was that all of a sudden you busted out of these small platforms, right, which was AOL and CompuServe, and you actually had an open internet that was fundamentally in its interactions non-commercial in the space you occupied. We've now gone back to a universe in which we're all operating commercial spaces all the time, right? So the platform in every instance has a goal, which is to maximize the use of your attention. It does not actually have to be that way. I mean, there are non-commercial
Okay, so that's where I wanted to
ways.
go with this. When you say it doesn't have to be that way.
Well, because we had an open internet before. There are still platforms that are relatively open. There's still protocols that are relatively open. Podcasts is a great example.
It's clunky and it's harder to get to some of this stuff.
Exactly, and that's the sort of trade-off, right? But podcasts are a great example, right? Podcasts operate on an open protocol. They operate off the back of RSS, which was developed years ago that like anyone can use. And when you hear the phrase, wherever you get your podcasts, right?
Right.
That's like the openness of the old internet, that it's not contained in a platform that in every moment is trying to monetize your attention.
Look, I agree with you. I think that is totally the goal of this, and we feed off these negative things. But I would also say that the precursor to what we see with the social media companies right now are the cable companies. The cable companies do the same thing.
Totally, yes.
And for decades, people were blaming the cable companies, particularly the far right and the far left, in terms of politics, was saying the cable companies
are monetizing this. Yes,
and they're doing the same thing, and they're trying to rile people up and give this rabid sort of delivery, and that's why the ratings were so good for cable companies.
And believe me, I mean, I live this every day.
I
right?
know, that's why I'm.
And the thing that I think about, the way that I think about our role as journalists, right, is like the Fed's dual mandate.
Okay.
Right?
This is interesting. I like this. Coming to Squawk with some real
central bankers have a dual
financial-
mandate, and they have to basically deal with two goals that are in tension with each other, which is why it's hard to be a central banker, right? They want to keep unemployment low, they want to keep inflation low, the growth high, right? And those sometimes there's trade-offs between them. In journalism, what I'm trying to do is like keep people's attention and also give them the tools for self-governance.
You're just mad that somebody is out angering the crowds and getting them more addicted on social media than we do on television.
Well, no, because I actually think there's like an actual civic role for journalism that's being destroyed.
I agree, but I would also say that some of the far right and far left that we see in politics is not straight up journalism. It is taking a side and a perspective and then heating and fomenting.
Totally, and I think that attentional incentives for that are enormous.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it all the time. Our politics are defined by a kind of trolling now.
So where do you land ultimately on the sort of community notes of it all? And both in the sort of X land and increasingly now it's going to be in the meta land. I ask because there's an element to which you can argue that there's sort of like a truth to it, right? It's everybody can just put up whatever they want. There are no journalism, no gatekeepers. Someone on the street down here will see somebody do something and they'll just write in that this is what just happened. And it might be right, it might be wrong. Somebody might have a video of it. But that there were no the gatekeepers are all of us. Are we better? Who is the better gatekeeper? No, I actually think this is the fundamental question, right? Do we want gatekeepers? Do we not want gatekeepers? And I have very mixed views of this situation. I have very, very mixed views of it because, interestingly, I go back actually to 2020, and I think about vaccines. I think about, by the way, there was like a whole meme craze, and someone like myself, I would come on the air and I would say, "Be careful, folks. I think this is a little bit anxiety-producing." And people would say, I don't need you to be my parent. Stop trying to protect me. And by the way, you're trying to protect me from the man. You're trying to protect the man. You're not trying to protect me. And it's a very interesting sort of like flip of what I thought the responsibilities of a journalist were supposed to be. People said, you're not supposed to be protecting us from these things. We actually want to see them. We want to know it. Anyway.
Well, so here's my thing.
I don't know the answer.
So I write in the book about what I call attentional regimes, like a debate, Lincoln Douglas, right? Like any social interaction, any meeting, right, has an attentional regime, like who can speak when, what you're talking about, an agenda. And that's necessary because attention is a means towards some end. What we're seeing is when you have a breakdown of attentional regimes, the end itself is attention. It's just getting attention and nothing else, right? So part of what I'm talking when you talk about gatekeepers, it's like, what is the purpose of whatever a given platform is? Is it just to maximize the seconds of eyeballs on it? Or is it to do something else, like give people the tools they need to invest or to like run a democracy?
But ultimately, the additional choice leaves the choice up to the viewer. Do you want to spend more time with this gated community where people you decide you trust or don't trust are feeding you things, or do you want to have access to anything and everything? And that's
sure. And I think I think people can go both ways, right? There's different parts of ourselves. I think what we've ended up doing is basically reinventing the village rumor. right? So the idea that like you're the media is like, yeah, well, we've had that for hundreds of years, right? The Salem witch trials was you are the media. She looks like a witch.
Right.
Like we've definitely tried that before.
Chris Hayes, the book is called The Sirens Call, and let me just say, really, no matter what your politics, I could actually see somebody who's completely far on the right level of this
totally.
book,
It's
and I
not
think people
mostly,
are far on the left. It doesn't matter,
Yeah.
but it's fascinating because it really gets at, I think, what's happening in society. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And that's the podcast for today. Thanks for your attention. Yeah, wherever you get your podcasts. Squawk Box is hosted by Joe Kernan, Becky Quick, and Andrew Ross Sorkin. Weekday mornings on CNBC at 6 Eastern. Follow Squawk Pod wherever you listen and get us in your feed every day. Don't miss a minute. We'll meet you right back here tomorrow.
We are clear. Thanks, guys.